Guten Abend und herzlich willkommen. Mein Name ist Patrick Schostak.
Good evening and a warm welcome. My name is Patrick Shostak and I'm the PR representative of the Pilecki-Institut in Berlin, and I'm very happy that I can welcome you to already the second event within the frames of events, Living Archives, the fascinating world of documentary comics. This is a project that is very close to our hearts. It's about work with archives, digitalization of archaic material, and research. And this is one of the main tasks of the Berlin branch of the Pilecki-Institut, which has organized today's events. Living Archives brings young artists together to show documentary comic as a mean of addressing history and archive research, and also to connect and network with one another. It's about bringing to the surface the full potential of comic books, which had a really big boom in the last years, not only philosophy, history, also Bible has been adapted as a graphic novel. It's also about the plea towards working with archives and showing them as something more than working with old dusty books. Before we start, a few words about the Pilecki-Institut in Berlin. We are here since we've been here since 2019. We concentrate on Poland, the 20th century, and the European history. Normally, we would invite you to our exhibition about Witold Pilecki and his enormous work in Auschwitz, but it's going to be difficult within the next weeks. Our online program is on, however, and we also record our events so you can see them later on social channels, social media channels, and on YouTube. And we are going to present another event on Ostwind in the movement in the GDR. And we're also going to talk about different representations of the 1990s during this event. So it would be nice if you joined us. That's enough for now. I will pass on to Kai, and I'm looking forward together with him and with all of us here to spend this evening with two really big names in the world of comics. Kai, the floor is yours. Hello and welcome to everyone. Just a brief introduction of Ulli Lust. I'm Kai Pfeiffer, comic artist from Berlin, and I've been working together with Ulli for a long time. We've known each other from our studies. Before she started working on comics professionally, we launched a group of students at the school in Weißensee, and we started working on documentary comics, and this is something that has been following Ulli in her work on comics ever since. And I would say that pretty much everything that she's been doing is somehow based on documentary roots. She became very well known internationally for readers with her comic published in 2009. Today is the last day of the rest of your life, which was an autobiographical work in which she described and showed her own memories and experiences that she researched as well. So her own experience was her source for a documentary story. Today, she will talk about a different project. She will move us back to the history of the Third Reich, and she will talk about an adaptation of a book by Marcel Bayer, Voices in the Dark. And this will be something that she will be talking to us about in the next 45 minutes. I will now pass the floor to her. At the end, there will be an option of asking questions. So if you have any questions, please write them down in the chat. We will have the time to answer at least some of them, and myself and Ulli Lust. And so now enjoy the lecture by Ulli Lust. The floor is yours, Ulli. Thank you, Kai, for this wonderful introduction. You have taken a lot of work off my shoulders. I will share my screen in just a second, and I hope I will manage to speak slowly since this lecture is going to be interpreted simultaneously. Normally, I tend to speak very fast. So these two books that were the autobiographical books that were mentioned by Kai, they are here for those of you who do not know my books, so that you get an impression of what I do. This was a really adventurous trip of two teenagers, a trip to Italy in the 1980s. And this book has been published 3 years ago, and this is a continuation, also an autobiographical story. In between, I also dealt a lot with historical issues. I'm interested in history in general, and comics are a really good medium to bring history back to life and to visualize it, because I don't need a large scenography. A drawer has to be able to imagine and to draw how he sees history or she, and it's easier to cope with this. So to show a historical scene, that's easier than, for example, in the medium of film. Back then, so some years ago, I read a lot about the history of the city of Berlin for a different project that at the end did not work out. But some rests of this work was a discovery of school stories written by children in Berlin from 1946. And this school writing was formulated in a very pragmatical way. These kids described last years of war in Berlin, the Second World War in Berlin, with straightforward pragmatism. Here's a story about a cake that was baked, and there was this bombing alarm that met these people in a church. Now they're here in a bunker, and here's a description of the detonation of the ground shaking and new bombs falling off the sky. And all of a sudden, I thought that the sky and the soil will unite. I thought that the ceiling will fall off my head any second. I heard my aunt screaming, and the new bombs fell on us. We also heard some other noises. That was the water that came up, since one of the pipes, the water pipes, was hit by one of the pipes. I can't read this here. Through the walls came down. Some people were hit by the walls falling down, and thankfully they did not die. It was just their legs that were stuck. In the kitchen, there was our beautiful cake that was full of glass pieces. I was very sad about this. So this is an authentic story written by school children who experienced this bombing. And when the Surkamp publisher asked me to draw based on a book, on a novel, when I saw Flughunde, so Voices in the Dark, this was something that reminded me a lot about these school stories. To the book itself, it was published in Strittberger, a Slovenian publication, and there were editors who brought this book together. So that was this Best War Comics, this huge edition, and there are different stories in there collected about the war. So this is a great honor to be included in this book. But what was interesting was that only two female authors were included in this book. The rest were men, and only three of these stories did not glorify the war. So the fascination that is somehow reflected in the perception of wars with men is something very interesting. I do not possess any fascination with war, and I did not plan to take the Second World War as a topic for myself, but this novel by Marcel Bayer is a fascinating mixture of fiction and documentary. And as he started working on it, he invented a fictional sound designer who works for radio station and who actually works, who's actually a scientist and who studies the human voice and has this passion for human sounds, and he wants to record everything on tape. And he's the sound technician of Joseph Goebbels and gets to know through Joseph Goebbels his children. And when Marcel Bayer wrote this book, he first had only the sound designer in his head, and then he had this impression that this story is not quite ready, that something is missing in it, and then he did some extensive research, and then finally he found these children of Goebbels as a second very important anchor in this story. So there are two narrators, the kids, and the sound technician, and I could do a lot of research about the children. Maybe I should say here today I'm giving this lecture in relation to what kind of research material was used in this comic. If I was to present this comic, I would do a reading, but today I am supposed to talk mostly about the research and the work related to the research that I conducted. So here there are many photos of these children. There were 6 kids, five girls and 1 boy. This boy grew up among girls, and he was quite girlish. He had troubles with his father, who was always somehow neglecting him, did not like this girly side of him. And these children, or the time frame of the book, that's several years. At the beginning, they're quite small, and Helga, the narrator, is at the beginning of the book around 8 years old. At the end, she's about 14. So these characters had to grow in the book, and I tried in terms of drawings to fit or to adjust the drawings to the protagonist. So at the beginning, they're quite childish, and then they grow together with the characters, the drawings. Here's the mother. Goebbels, it was said that she had a really cold sight. And here there are many of variants of options of the main characters in order to find the right way to depict them. When working on historical comics, what is a relief is that people tend to wear uniforms, especially in the Nazi times. So it was important that particular groups are wearing the same uniforms. Today it's not much different, but back then it was much stronger than today, and that makes it easier for me as a comic artist to draw scenes as to which I can perform some research, and I can roughly estimate what particular people would wear on a given occasion. So 30 years ago, it was much more ritualized what kind of clothing you would wear for which occasion. So I had to research what was back then the uses, what was common, and then it's quite easy to find the right clothing. Goebbels was easy to draw. The sound technician was more difficult. I found a telephone operator in the bunker, and he became my an example that I followed in terms of drawings. I gave him glasses, and I made Mr. Karnow out of him. He was the telephone operator in the bunker. These pieces of paper I I put on a wall because I had to draw them equally through the 400 pages. I researched what sound technicians do. I researched in museums, and the best materials I found in libraries. Mm. On the internet, there are lots of curiosities, but if you want to find what kind of adapters were used, mm, in the 1940s, books are more informative what kind of equipment was used. I had to use for recorders on tape. And so this is very important. If you want to draw a comic, you have to also draw the furniture, the interior design, how did the plugs looked like, etc. So you have to research a lot for a documentary comic. Here, that's a parade, quite a typical one for the Nazi times. Marcel Bayer, however, did not describe a parade of beautiful soldiers or healthy soldiers, but since he did not want to glorify the Nazi soldiers, the perspective that he took upon is a perspective of a victim. So that's quite important. The situation is it's early morning, and the Hitler Jungen practice a march within a parade, and it doesn't work as it should, this rehearsal. When I worked on the book, I read the novel by Marcel Bayer, and I used a blue and a red crayon. And with the red one, I underlined the passages that I wanted to use in my comic as text, and the other ones, with the other one, I matched what I do not want to use. A big problem in adaptation of text is that a text is extremely detailed, extremely, here, for example, one sentence. And in addition, in a radius of 1 meter, no, sorry, that's not the right sentence. Sorry, Carolina. Which one was it? So in text, there are a lot of jumps. So the author jumps all the time. He changes the perspective all the time. And in my pictures, in my drawings, I could not reflect this. In text, the movement can be done very quickly. In a comic, I need loads of space. So in the book, I had to leave like 2/3 of it behind because it wouldn't be possible to adapt it in fullness. This was my desk at the time. This is how it looked like. This is the research, the photos on the right-hand side, and the middle. These are ready, already prepared drawings, and here on the left-hand side, that's also like research material. And I had the historical books on the side also at the same time, the ones that I was using at a given time. Apart from that, there were lots of films, Hitler in color, people during the war. There are also films about the children of Goebbels. The Goebbels as a glamorous family were often objects of portrait, of filmic portrayals. So the beautiful children and their beautiful mother. This is Helga, the oldest daughter. She's here about 12 years old. And this is the house in Bogensee that also appears in the comic. I went there. This is how it looks like today. And also, I developed a scene out of it. I used the rooms that I saw in there. And here they sit in the garden and they learn each other. They meet each other for the very first time. This is Karnau's perspective, and the layout is a little bit more dense. The children, when Helga talks, I always use the square, simple layout. This seemed for me more appropriate for this narrative done by a child. So this is something the frames differ according to who is speaking. These are some of the findings from the research that I conducted, the most interesting ones. Right, so this is the only lighting example to follow for any good German, and these were lighting buttons. This is a postcard, black sun, postcard of Adolf Hitler. This is something that produces a large unease. I read, of course, everything that referred to the people in the bunker, all autobiographical reports of people who were there, of the soldiers, especially concerning the bunker. There are lots of books. Stumpfegger is one of the high officials that also appears in my comic. I'm going here through the pictures quite fast. It's just meant to produce an impression. That was a famous speech. What was the name of it? A speech by Goebbels at the end of the war, in which he talks about the total war. And here Marcel Bayer worked with the scene and combined it with a scene of this tone technician, the sound technician, working with like conducting experiments. And the daughters listen to their father when he gives his speech. And in between, Marcel Bayer also drifts into some technician or historical aspects or associative thinking. And at the end, this girl is really tired, and the mother says, "Father did not smoke for 2 hours." Wow. Half of the book is set in the bunker. This was something that made the work on it very unpleasant. In terms of research, there's nothing that can be found and nothing left. The bunker is not available. You can't enter it. Thanks to God. These are photos that were taken by the Russians after the capitulation. There is a architectonic plan of the Führer bunker. It was built in the last years of the war, and it wasn't done. Most of all, it wasn't dried until the end. That's how it looked like couple of years after the war. So there's water in there. It's very humid. We know that the groundwaters in Berlin are very high. This is the setting for the film, The Bunker. The film was made in not a bad manner. I read really almost everything, the literature that I could get hold of about the last years of the war and all the stories about the bunker, the reports. But the film, The Bunker, showed it in a really good way. I think that they've done here a really good job in terms of scenography. The space is bigger than it really was because they needed space for their camera. And in order to move this camera, they had to design these rooms, the spaces a bit larger than they were, in fact. So I had to keep that in mind. But on the other hand, comic is a rather atmospheric, surrealistic work. So it's a mixture. This was the house from the outside. What was the name of it? Reichstag? I'm not sure. That Hitler designed the furniture himself, I heard. Great thing, great stuff. That's how it looked like after the Russians have taken over. In the story, you can see how the children, how they have to move into the bunker in the last month. Bombs are falling, and the spaces inside are already a little bit damaged. The children were actually quite happy in the bunker, quite cheerful. Everybody said that. The only one who was sad was the 14-years-old Helga, and most probably, or the other people in the bunker had the impression that she was the only one who had the impression that she wouldn't ever leave the bunker again. In the American edition, the publisher took over designing the cover. So without letting me know, once I just noticed I received this cover, and these were small frames that were enlarged here, and I did like it, but I have to say it's a bit embarrassing to me that this tear looks a little bit like chewing gum. If I had known that this small picture would land on the cover, I would most probably have drawn it in a different way. This is the colors. I worked mostly with aquarelle blue and red. On a lighting table, I had the line drawings underneath so that I knew roughly where the lines are, and then I drew structures with aquarelle and then I scanned them. When you work on the computer, you can distinguish between the blue and the red, and then I had two different structures that I could adjust according to the colors. So what is yellow here used to be red. So red and blue are the biggest extremes in terms of colors that you can have, and I could draw structures with it, and then I added additional colors, additional surfaces as well. To explain what that is, Helmut, the sound technician in the book, it seems, or in the book, there is the suggestion that he recorded the children in the bunker in the last days, and he survives the war, and later on he digs in his recordings and finds the recordings of the children, and then there are different models of how these children could have died. So there are different drawings with different opinions who could have done this, maybe Kaino himself even. In the text, these were different examples, different types of text. There was this one part that was written as a report, as a criminal report. Sometimes there was a style of text that was full with different thoughts. So these were different styles, and it was also interesting to try to find the right way to adapt it in a comic. Most probably the mother brought her children to sleep using a sleeping aid, a sleeping medicine. There are photos on the internet of the bodies of the children that were brought into the backyard by the Russians. I thought for a long time about showing photo of the naked body of Helga, and then I decided against it. I think this photo is bad enough. Also, this one here, I will show this one here because I used it in my comic. This is also the body of Helga. Here is a quote by Joseph Goebbels. He was the Reichschancellor for a very short time after the suicide of Hitler, and then he gave a speech in a press conference. If we should perish, then the entire German nation will perish with us, and so gloriously that even after 1,000 years, the heroic defeat of the Germans will be inscribed in the world history at the very first place. I want to point to the fact that these children and what happened to them will be something that followed the history of Goebbels ever since, and also lots of other terrible things in the book. There's another abduction report, and I think this is the real report from the abduction.
Und irgendwann ist die Aufnahme zu Ende und es ist still.
And at some point, the recording is over and everything is quiet. People who committed suicide, who thought there was no future without the Nazis, without the Second World War. Thank you so much. That's all, I think. So it was a bit faster than I thought. If you have any questions, I am here. I'm ready to answer. Can you hear me? As Ulli just said, now is an option to ask questions in the Q&A section, or F and A in the German version. I can see the first question already. How long have you worked on this? Did you work on this book? And also, if you could explain the technique, the drawing technique. Right, so I worked for 3 years on this book, and the technique, that's pencil, and when it's being scanned, the contrasts become really high, really hard. So it's a pencil as a black line tool, and the background, as I said, I worked with aquarels, the blue and the red structures, and then I scanned it and worked on it on my computer and changed or adjusted the colors. I put them into different color channels. It's a bit complicated, all of it, but among all, I always paid attention to the fact that every scene should only have 2 colors, plus 1 additional color. So the scenes with the children have 1 additional color, and the other ones with the tone technicians, there are 2 additional colors that are being mixed with one another. Another question, Vence. When do you set an end to the research? Do you set a name when to end? I really enjoy conducting research, and so it actually never is, then there never is an end to it. But when I get the impression that the story is a good one, that would be the point in which I would set an end to the research normally. Have I forgot something?
Gut.
No, that sounds good. Another question from Natalie Frank, one of our authors in the project Living Archives. How do you get along with fake news? Do you allow yourself to invent scenes? Yes, I have allowed myself to invent scenes. For example, when adapting some parts of the book, I didn't find it appropriate to stay so strictly connected to the book. I allowed myself some freedom in inventing some scenes, And there are some scenes that I invented entirely because I thought they are missing. So I think it's okay to go freely with it. It's thankfully a work of fiction. It's not a documentary piece. So maybe readers think that all of the scenes come from Marcel Bayer, and this is not entirely true, right? So this is something special about the book. It's based on historical background. It features historical real figures, but there are also fictional elements. And there is this maybe naive impression that you have adapted this novel one-to-one, that you adapted it in a comic form. But of course, there are many decisions that you had to made, and these artistic forms can nurture one another. One other interesting point, Marcel Bayer described the bunker as a silent place where you cannot listen to any sounds, when you cannot hear any sounds. And I read another historical text about the bunker, and it appeared to be really loud. There was this ventilation machine that was permanently producing noise, and I thought it was interesting to try to draw the noise, continuous noise, acoustic stress in the comic. This was something that was interesting to me. We have another question from Butcho Türker, our colleague from Berlin. How did you feel working on this book? Was it difficult for you to deal with this topic for such a long time? Yes, I needed half a year to decide whether I really want to work on this. I found this history fascinating, but I knew I will have to spend 3 years with this story, with the history surrounding it, with these people, and it was not nice back then. As a something very different to it, I found the Kit Kat Club and the nightlife. Maybe this is something that can even fit to one another. So National Socialists and perversion. So we are sinking in this depressing atmosphere of the bunker, and then we move to the club life in Berlin. This is a program, a contrast program, so to say, and it also reminds us of Berlin in the time before the war, the Berlin of the 1920s, and this really extensive nightlife of the city. And at the same time, this bunker architecture that in terms of one of the clubs in Berlin, for example, is now reused in the and very prominent in the night scene. So yeah, that was as a some kind of an antidotum for me when working on these very difficult stories. Another question: were you in touch with Marcel Bayer when working on it? Yes, and he agreed for me to work on this comic because when we met, he read one of my comics that was set in Rome, and he was in Rome at the time, and he agreed on me adapting this book to a comic, but he did not want to participate in the making. He wanted me to have full freedom while working on it, and he read the finished comic, and he loved it. And then we organized several joint events when, for example, he read an excerpt from his book, and then I would show the fitting excerpt or the corresponding excerpt from my comic. Marcel Bayer was happy to give this book to me, and he was interested to know what I can do with this. But there were some questions that he was not happy with answering during the event. I remember that you were happy about this freedom that Marcel Bayer has granted you. On the other hand, you sometimes wished for a little bit of explanation in terms of the language of the book in adaptation for the comic. I did not allow myself to provide changes to this very elaborate language of Marcel Bayer, in which I cannot conduct any changes. If I invented scenes, I also invented text. I think for the comic, sometimes it was useful to change the text a little bit, and consequently, I could have maybe I wished for a review of the text in the comic after the drawings were done by the author. But on the other hand, it was good that he did not want to touch it, because maybe he would have had corrections that I wouldn't be happy with. So, yeah. But that must have been a challenge for the author, maybe for the first time, to see his text in a comic form and to open himself to it and to find a language economy that would suit our genre in terms of rather limited place. You also said that you did not change a lot, but when inventing new scenes, you invented also text, and it was enough for a critic of the Süddeutsche Zeitung who wrote about your adaptation of Voices in the Dark, and he had this ambition to compare the novel and the comic, and he provided some quotes to prove his point. And there were several mistakes where he was apparently quoting or seemingly quoting from the book, but at the end there were quotes from your comic. So there is a little bit of a naivete related to the process of adaptation, and so sometimes dialogues have to be adapted, and the comic requires sometimes a different language, a language that is supposed to build new unities, and it's not exactly the same measures that work in prose in a text. There's another question. Mayan Guyanyo. What about the copyrights? What do you have to take under consideration when you talk about a visual adaptation of a text? Yeah, so you need a copyright unless an author has been dead for 75 years or longer, then his work is copyright free. But other than this, you need the copyright from the author. And in this case, this was the Surkamp Verlag, the publisher. They looked for a piece of work that they would like to be adapted. And then there was also the second question, whether the holder of the copyrights is going to agree with authors who are still alive, like Marcel Bayer. Sometimes it's difficult, and sometimes it's very much dependent on whether they feel like it or not. Sometimes it's even more complicated if there is a foundation that manages copyrights. I remember we were once working on an adaptation of Waiting for Godot by Beckett, and it was very difficult to get hold of the manager of the rights by Beckett. Thanks God, it didn't work out. No. Yeah, so our project turned out to be an adaptation of Thomas Bernhard's work, and that was easier, and it turned out to be a success for the publisher as well. So yes, we have a question from Kai Aldrich from Great Britain.
Ja, also ob du dich beschäftigt hast mit den nach Südamerika geflohenen.
So have you dealt with the National Socialists who escaped to South America? Not really, like Mengele, for example. Not really, no.
Ja, also dieser Roman.
So this novel. So there was, let's say, an afterplay with the fictitious protagonist, and we also we looked a little bit at the first years after the war in Germany. But it's an interesting question, and maybe within the project Living Archives, this is something that will play a role. We don't know yet. Another question from Zida Dimitris. Hello, Ulli. What is your process, your writing process when working on comics if you do not have a text that you're adapting? Yeah, so I start with a brainstorming. I have a notebook that I use for this, and I put down everything that comes into my mind. This is my current notebook. and I draw the scenes at the same time mostly. So the drawings in the notebook are helping me collecting my thoughts. The final drawings. This is something I start with in storyboards with pencil. This is a script, and here I combine the text with the pictures. And normally this works very well because I don't write them anywhere else. I develop them in this flow of drawings. Okay, we have one last chance for those of you who would like to ask some questions. So far, we have answered all of your questions. We have some more minutes, and then we'll slowly approach the end. But you will hear from us in this channel. The Living Archive project is going to be continued. This is just the beginning. This is something that we want to collect different comics about totalitarian regimes and its history around the world. We want to publish these comic stories in a book, and if everything works out, it should be published in autumn, in the fall of the next year. And until then, this year, there will be a program and other guests and authors who will present their work. And this is going to be continued also next spring until April. And Ulli and myself and René Pavalis, we do the curatorial work in this project. And the next event, that's going to be the 28th of November, Birgit Bayer from Hamburg will be here via Zoom. She will talk about her work. She's one of the authors who work with documentary comics a lot and move between autobiographical and research work. So that's Saturday, the 28th of November. You can put that down in your calendars. And following authors will be presented here next year. And I can see we have some more questions here. 2 last questions. Also from the circle of our colleagues who are comic artists, Jakob and Hinrichs, Katja Fouquet. The question from Katja Fouquet. So, and how far for you did it play a role when working on this comic that the figures had such negative roles? Does it make a difference for you as an artist? I think it's also time to tell the stories about the oppressors. So there are loads of stories about the Second World War which take over the perspective of the victim. And I think it's important to also tell the stories of the oppressors. And it was interesting and motivating for me to take upon this perspective. The child is guiltless. The child is not guilty. You can't accuse the child. The sound technician is another figure. And we have another question. Maybe we can wait for one last question. If there is a question, we have Don Hoskins, who is asking about copyright issues.
I don't think so.
I also,
also ich versuche, bitte? Ja, ich versuche.
Yeah, try to maybe speak in German, it's interpreted. Yeah, so I'm trying to, when I try not to adapt a photography one-to-one. I try to add elements, and I don't think it should cause any copyrights. I know about one case where a colleague copied illustrations from a colleague, and he he really protested against it, and there was a jurisdictional conflict. But I don't think there are any copyright issues with documentary photography that I used here. This surely is a big question in art, specifically in comic as an art form, the question of copyrights. As far as I know, that's a bit of a different issue than, for example, in music, where normally there are big issues. In the realm of art, of fine arts, it usually is about the context. So if using something you produce a completely different context, then it can be judged as your own work. And when working on a comic, I think there is a form of adaptation that is strong, that is severe, so that the comic is its own piece of work and piece of art. And maybe there is a gray zone when you talk about if you wanted to use a photograph adapted to a drawing and use it for a cover, maybe that could lead to a problem. But in the world of the fine arts, usually these processes went well. In Belgium, Louis Kaiman recently lost a case. He was drawing historical photos for his in his installation and in his paintings. And he adapted a press material, a press photography, and he's in one of his paintings, and he received he had to face a trial, and he lost it, even though the context was a very different one. But that didn't work out for him very well here. So if you have any doubts, the suggestion would be, or the idea would be to ask. Okay, I think that was the last question for today. So thank you so much, Ulli, for the lecture. Thank you, Kai. And I hope to see some of you at least on the 28th of November with Birgit Meyer, and I wish you a nice evening. Take care of yourself in the lockdown that we're going to be facing starting Monday. We are stuck at our desks, which is not so much news to us, but for lots of people, it's a huge change. So have a good evening and thank you. Bye.